and welcome to the second episode of the Public Education Now podcast, a student initiative unpacking the effects of privatization and how we can create more just, equitable, and sustainable futures. In our previous podcast episode, we discussed how international donor organizations influence education policy in Kenya. And today I am joined by Lucas Felicetti to talk about how private actors approach the right to education, especially in the Brazilian context, and the implications of this for national education policy. Lucas recently completed a PhD in education policy from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, where his research topic was the human right to education under threat, the role of liberal think tank in Brazilian education policy. He is currently a visiting scholar at the New York University and associate researcher at the National Institute of Science and Technology for teaching work and education policy. Hello, Lucas.
Hey, Rabia, thanks for having me.
All right. It's so lovely to have you here. And I guess we can start by you telling me a bit about your research and in the current context, why it is important to understand private actors' approaches to the right to education.
Sure. So, my research draws on the idea of the existence of global networks of private and state actors trying to impose their agendas on education policy. Stephen Bowles and some colleagues, including Carolina Juniman, uh, Diego Santori and Marina Villar often writes about that. And this notion is that these different actors, including international organizations, corporate actors, companies, consultancies, even state actors, and specifically for my research, think tanks, they are somewhat entangled in a global context where they mobilize uh, actors, people, ideas, policies, and these ideas are often connected to a neoliberal perspective on education. So these actors in acting diverse ways because it's a diverse network with many different actors, but with the common agenda to promote mm, pro-market reforms in the educational systems and to promote the idea, the concept of education tied to the notion of human capital and contrast with the ideas education as a human right, focus on forming human dignity, the social and political instrumental value of education to enforce human dignity. So, considering this, uh, I began to understand that there are many ways for these actors to impact the education policies, and specifically about the think tanks, because they are really under research in the educational literature overall. So I wanted to understand, how do they act? How do they promote education policies? How do they fit in this realm that we are researching? So
Okay, that's quite interesting. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which is what made you interested in think tanks in the first place?
think tanks are usually perceived in a way that they create, produce, or as Christopher Lubianski and some colleagues calls, they orchestrate knowledge. They do not necessarily produce it, but
Mhm.
they frame it in a way that is uh, seen as good for policymakers to promote their own agendas. And their agendas are really tied to this neoliberal way of seeing education. And one thing that really stood me, besides the uh, think tank's way of doing educational policy, is that when you start perceiving how these actors conceive education, there are many different works. There's a really robust body of work analyzing how these actors uh, understand education, if it is seen as a human right or not, specifically for international organizations, companies, but there are no works regarding think tanks. So they're not usually studied in the field, and their impact on the right to education, their perception of education is not seen. So I wanted to kind of blend these two points of analysis. How do think tanks work in educational sense, in the educational policy sphere, and how do they perceive education? If their idea of education is connected to an idea of educational policies, in the way that they do not necessarily uh, buy schools, promote create textbooks. They're not instructional actors for the
Mm.
educational policies in a global sphere, but they influence the policy making process.
Yeah.
Uh, as Tony Verger says, as Tony Verger, Stephen Boyd, some other colleagues, they usually use the idea of privatizing the education policy.
Yeah.
And I was looking to think tanks through that lens. So they are not just investing in education, they are totally change the political process of how education policies are made.
And can you give us an example of a think tank that you looked at?
To dig into some think tanks that are acting here in Brazil, and I came up with livres, which means in free translation could be the free folks, the free guys,
Okay.
and this, yeah, it's kind of interesting. And this think tank, they call themselves as a multi-partisan, super partisan movement that, in the same time, they orchestrate expert knowledge in many different aspects, in many different fields, including education policies. And these uh, materials that they produce are built up in a way to influence individual freedoms, to promote market reforms in education, and to focus on the lesser and lesser impact of the state regulation in education policy. So the the private can do whatever they want to education, because the state is it's kind of harming our freedom, our rights, our liberty to defend our ideas in the educational system overall.
So you've already mentioned that they present knowledge and promote market-based ideas, but what else is it that they do?
Not only they uh, promote this material they do not only orchestrate the knowledge, but they also and this really stood with me, is the idea that they train new political leaders. They not only uh, give them some info to promote policies, but they train policymakers for them to achieve this state as elected politicians. So they help them preparing themselves in a subject manner, like training them how to engage themselves in the electoral system in Brazil, to how they can create public policies, how they can connect to get funding to promote their ideas in the political system overall. And political they have political leaders trained in almost every state in Brazil. We have more than 26 states in Brazil, and they're connected to they're acting the federal sphere, the state sphere, the many municipalities. They have mayors, councilwomen, congressmen, and mm, they're all over Brazil promoting their political agenda uh, in the discourse of individual freedoms in education.
So this kind of makes me think about this think tank and think tanks more generally, that they tend to operate in diverse contexts. So do you think that they work alone or are they connected to others?
I think it's really important is that this institution is not like in the vacuum.
Yeah.
It is part of a great and big network of pro-market think tanks that works globally. It is
Okay.
named Atlas. Yeah, it is named Atlas Network, and
Yeah.
uh, it has more than 500 think tanks all over the world in more than 100 countries, and it has some many important think tanks in the US. In the US, for example, they have the Heritage Foundation that's really tied to Trump's agenda. Uh, Cato Institute, also in the US. And one of the most important think tanks of Atlas Network is the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK. And there are many others in every region of the world. And they are keep promoting this pro-market idea. So Libres is a really important node of this network working in Brazil, and not just promoting discourses, as many uh, works studying institutions like that, usually using the frame as intermediary organizations, advocate for they just promote knowledge and do, I don't know,
Yeah.
trying to influence to advocate for the ideas. Livres does that, but not only that, they
Yeah.
promote, they train government officials to really promote their agenda from within the government. So I
Okay.
think that's the whole idea.
Yeah. No, that's actually very interesting, and it makes me very curious that why is this such an under-researched area? Because now, in recent years, decades actually, we've had a lot of research on IOs, international organizations, donor organizations, and how they influence education policy. So we're starting to look into that more. But I'm very curious to like understand why think tanks aren't that well researched. Is it perhaps because they're seen more in the sphere of, even if they don't act that way, given the context in which you've explained how Libers works, is it because they're seen more as partisan organizations, more civil society based organizations? Do you think that's one of the reasons? And the fact that they are generally, when you think of think tanks, you see them as knowledge production organizations, even if they aren't playing that role when you look deeper into it. So, is that perhaps one of the reasons that this is such an under researched area when we look at pro marketization forces in education?
Okay, that's a really hard question to answer. Thank you so much for that. Uh, I think it's a bit of everything that you have said. The one point that is really important that is that they usually are not in plain sight. They are
Okay.
not as visible as international organizations. They're not as visible as big corporations. They work from underneath. They
Okay.
are doing their connections, they're doing their bridges, they're promoting their agendas within and outside the government, within and outside corporations. And there's a American sociologist. His name is Thomas Medveds. He says that think tanks work on the frontier of social fields, and
Yeah.
these social fields using Bourdieu social fields concept, and he says that think tanks work on the borders of um, the media field, the academic field, the economic field, and the political field. They usually blend into these fields, into advocating using the strategies of these actors, but not actually becoming one of them. So, leaders, for example, they have their trained politicians. They work as they used to call it. They kind of changed it because it was a bit embarrassing to advocate for that, but they usually call that their group of trained leaders were a freedom caucus, a freedom bench of elected politicians. So it was kind of giving a hint of what they want to do in the political system here in Brazil. but they try they are not necessarily a political party, but they really influence the political doing of their trained leaders in the way
Yeah.
they somewhat act like a party, but they're not entitled to the party rights, and they do not have to fulfill parties obligations. So they kind of deviate from certain types of accountability, so that makes them to flow in a way that most suits them, for them to promote their agenda. And their agenda is usually tied to who are funding them, who are connected to
Mm,
them, who their people, they are inside of the think tanks, are connected to. And you can see that there are many financial institutions, banks, big universities, philanthropic institutions. So the money is flowing. We cannot actually see this falling the money, as Stephen Ball says. Sometimes it's kind of hard because they don't advertise that much, but you can see who and where is acting on that, and how these think tank act. So in certain ways, is how these financial and powerful actors are acting in the educational systems and the political system. And their agenda is often focused on these pro-market ideas that diverge from the notion of education as a human right overall. So when you think about a think tank agenda on education, a think tank's agenda on education, you're actually somewhat thinking of how their institutions that back them up are thinking about education. So
yes, absolutely. And I think it's so interesting that you mentioned how there are other actors in the background that are kind of influencing the direction in which these think tanks act. And before we get into that, what I want to ask you is that, in the broadest of terms, what are the different ways that the right to education is conceptualized by different entities?
so another tough question, but this one's a bit tricky in a
Yeah.
way that the right to education has many layers. Is in the same time a social, civil, and political right, and it's a social, economic, and cultural right. If you consider specifically the political and civil rights, you usually talk about negative rights, in the way that negative rights means that the state must, usually according to the literature, state must not influence, must not harm, must not, the state has to respect those rights. So you have your civil right, your political right, because the state, it's not opposing you to get it, it's not harming your way to fulfill this right. And social political rights work in, social and economic rights work in a different manner. The state has the obligation to promote those rights. And so the state is the only actor that has power to fulfill these rights for the population. So if the state doesn't do that, these rights are not going to be guaranteed for the people. So education fits in both categories, in the way that state must not uh, impose any threats for people to being educated, but the state has the obligation to promote people to be educated, specifically in public systems and free and public systems. So both ideas are connected to the human right to education. If you consider a human rights based approach, usually from the human rights legislation and academic literature, on that you can understand it through three aspects: the human dignity, so the right to education has to be justified and promote human dignity. It has to have instrumental value, so just for the person, so for them to be able to work, to live in society, and to promote social um, I don't know, to promote a better way of living, quality of life for the whole society. And it has to be created, promoted, and protected, respected, and fulfilled by the state. So these are the three main axes: human dignity, instrumental values, and state's obligations.
Okay, that's quite a comprehensive overview of how different entities view the right to education. And kind of leading on from that, how do you think the think tanks that you have researched, how do they specifically perceive the right to education?
They perceive education as a human right, but focusing mainly slash only in the idea of education as a civil and political right. And one interviewee said to me that Leibniz's idea of the right to education, of education, is that education is a process, is a training process that promotes um, the capabilities of an individual to do their own choices. So it's not necessarily blending the individual to a bigger common and social sphere, but preparing this individual to make individual choices for them to create their own path. It's important. This is part of the education, the right to education notion. It's part of an education through a rights-based approach, but it's not only that. They are not the idea of understanding education goes numb when you think about the societal, the economic, and the cultural aspects of education in a social manner. And their idea is usually really tied to the instrumental value, but
Mhm.
focusing mainly in the individual sphere. So the state must not harm their individual value to the instrumental value of education, and the in dignity sense they only focus on the idea of individual decisions, not to create community, to promote community, to be around people, and to promote better ways of living in a communal sense, but more in an individual sense. And the state sphere is also problematic because they really endorse the idea that education has to have many way, like the individuals has to have many options to decide how education should work for them. And
I'm so sorry to cut you off, Lucas. I think we've gone a bit over time, but just a final comment on our conversation today. I think the nuances of understanding regarding the right to education that you've brought is really fascinating and at the same time concerning. The right to education, as you've explained and as explained in the Abidjan Principles, is so much more than the narrow definition they follow. To quote the Abidjan Principles, human rights treaties consistently frame education as integral to the full development of the human personality and a sense of dignity and self worth, as well as being indispensable to the promotion of peace, democracy, environmental sustainability, citizenship, and for realizing other human rights. In times such as these, and to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world, I feel like this broader definition of the right to education is absolutely essential. And on the subject of the Abidjan principles, I know that they are a big reference point that you've drawn on extensively during your research. And I look forward to discussing them with you in greater depth in the next episode of our podcast. Thank you again for joining us today. It has been so great hearing about your research. Views expressed during the podcast are those of the speakers alone. The inclusion of these views does not represent an endorsement by the Public Education Now team or PEHRC.